This podcast discusses external research, products, and views not endorsed by CSIRO. Please use your own judgment before relying on it. Visit csiro.au/everyday-AI for more.
CSIRO acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast was created. We pay our deepest respects to elders past and present, and to First Nations scientists, storytellers, and listeners. Throughout this series, we've been exploring the many ways that artificial intelligence has become part of our everyday lives. We've talked to people from all walks of life about the ways AI is interacting with us, from the cradle to the grave.
Hello there.
The Eagle has landed.
The CSIRO team.
What can I do for you?
The machines in the factories. Producing a computer program.
Temperature is approaching 500 degrees Celsius.
Beautiful. I've answered all your questions.
They can provide an attractive solution to tomorrow's energy needs.
I'm John Whittle, and this is Everyday AI, a podcast by CSIRO. We've reached the point where from the moment we're born, AI will be with us every step of the way, as we grow up, as we learn, get a job, start a family, all the way to our final days. In today's episode, the final one in the season, we're going to look at how AI is shaping the end of life and beyond. This episode was recorded live at South by Southwest in Sydney, where I was joined by a panel of guests. We cover a lot of ground, from the changes in our brains as we age to the role of AI in forensic science and criminal investigations. We delve into death and the ways AI is changing how we remember loved ones. And we ask the big question, can AI help us cheat death altogether? With so much of ourselves now stored online, in emails, texts, and social media, there's a whole new ethical and emotional dilemma. What happens to our data when we die? Should we bury it with us? Or could we create a digital version of ourselves, which allows our loved ones to communicate with us even after we're gone? This episode is all about how AI's growing influence is fundamentally changing the way we view life and death. Our first guest is Dr. Dana Bradford. She's a principal scientist at CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre, where she leads the neurodevelopmental and plasticity team. Essentially, she's an expert on everything happening inside our heads. Dana specializes in digital healthcare, including chronic illness management, mental health support, and technology for aging populations. Given she's a brain expert, my first question for her is, how do our brains change from the time we're born to the time we die?
So basically they shrink. They get smaller and smaller. And if we have conditions like dementia, then they shrink faster. So AI can help us with measuring the speed at which they shrink. Different areas of the brain shrink at different rates. And so one of the measures that we use for people with dementia is cortical thinning. So the cortex is kind of the outside of part of your brain where you do most of your thinking. And it's really actually quite thin. It averages about 2.5 millimetres. So you can imagine if we're trying to see if that's thinning, they're really, really small measurements that we're looking at. So AI can help us with the sensitivity of the methods that measure that. And we've got a technique now that can look to see if those methods are accurate down to 0.01 of a millimetre, which is pretty good. Not something I could do. So I think this is where AI is really helping with that sort of thing.
And how much are we actually talking about? I mean, what's the rough percentage of shrinkage from birth to death? I suppose it varies a
It
lot. but-
varies a lot from, and depending on the condition and depending on ethnicity and depending on, there's so many factors in there. I would say about a piece of string.
Then you mentioned the cortex. So just, for those of us who are maybe not brain experts, can you just remind us when you say cortex, what do you mean?
So it's a 6-layered structure on the outside of the brain. And it's actually built inside out, which is pretty cool. But all your senses come through pretty much everything that we do. There's one pathway to the brain that doesn't come through the cortex. So that's where the thinking happens. So almost everything you take in, you have a thought about. If you smell something, if you see something, if you feel something against your skin, it's almost always associated with a thought because it comes through the cortex. One pathway that doesn't. The vagus nerve goes from our brain down to our gut, and it goes directly to the thalamus. And so that's it. So our gut, our intuition, our feeling is the only pathway to the brain that doesn't go through the cortex.
So, but the cortex is then they're kind of channels to the brain. Is that a kind of layman's way of thinking of it?
You could. So it has different layers. And so some of the layers take information in, and then the next layer might send it out to somewhere else. So the brain's all about talking. And the outside layer of the cortex, we call it the chat room. It's where everything kind of talks to each other and says, where do we need to send this? Where do we need to send that? And then it sends it off to a different part of the brain.
Fantastic. And you said that as we age, the cortex thins.
That gets thinner.
The length of a piece of string.
The length
presumably?
of a piece of string, exactly.
Do we want to try and measure that thinning? Is that a good thing
That's
for
a measure.
clinicians to be doing?
Absolutely, that's a measurement that we are developing. So currently, AI is being used to measure the thinning of the cortex. But it's very variable, and the only way that we can test whether or not that method was accurate is by post-mortem. So not really the best way of going about things if you fancy living. So what we're doing now is at CSIRO we've developed these techniques that look at the accuracy of those methods, and so that's what I was saying, they can get that. Measure that accuracy down of those methods down to 0.01 of a millimetre, and you don't have to die. So thank you, AI.
And how does the AI do it? I mean, is it brain imaging that you do, or some other?
So
method?
it's using MRI, yes, so magnetic resonance imaging. I think most people are familiar with that term. So algorithms are developed, and they run the algorithm, and then this technique runs across those algorithms to see how effective they are and how accurate they are.
It's a fairly standard application of AI in imaging. In the podcast series 1, we talked to someone at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne who's looking at mammograms and looking at AI to detect breast cancer in mammograms. So it's a great application often for AI, is to look at images and then try and detect features of those images in a way that's more accurate than a human could do. But what you're saying, I think you said earlier that you can create your AI algorithm to try and detect how much the cortex is thinning, but you need to validate it, right?
That's right.
And you can't validate it until somebody actually dies, and you do a post-mortem, and then you open up the skull and literally look at the size of the cortex and measure it with a tape measure?
Well,
Is that what you do?
the problem with that, yeah, pretty much, but a very small tape measure.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that as soon as you die, the brain starts to shrink. So and really quite quickly. And so then if that autopsy isn't happening like straight away, then your measure's out. And we kind of know, we can guesstimate how much it's shrinking by, but there's still that difficulty. So that's why we need these methods while you're still alive.
Yeah. So the work that you're doing right now, it's less about trying to use the AI to do the measurement, but validate the AI that is starting to be used so that it can be used in the future to predict thinning.
Our group is doing that work, yes.
Yeah.
I don't want to take the credit for their work.
Let's segue slightly, because I know some other work that you do is on, various conditions that we get when we're older, such as dementia. And can you talk us through what the role of AI is, both, I suppose, in kind of predicting early onset of dementia, but perhaps more interestingly, allowing patients to actually live with dignity
Yes.
once they've got the condition.
Yeah, so I think this for me is where we put the heart into big data, and AI needs big data, but it's where we're looking after a particular person that I get most excited about it. And some examples of that are smarter, safer homes, where we've got a whole lot of passive sensors and they're detecting things like movement, or a suite of sensors might detect whether somebody's showering or making meals or that sort of thing. And we can use AI in those situations to be really proactive. So if the movement sensors show that there's problems with mobility, then it might be time to start getting a walker, and you can have those conversations. If it shows that the meal preparation isn't happening, then we know that we need to get some catering in. And we had a beautiful, one of my favourite participants ever. We're not allowed to have favourite participants, but she was mine, Mrs. L. But we had a pilot study of the smart homes, and she was a really savvy octogenarian. She was amazing. And one night she had a stroke. And she had a buddy system with a neighbour whereby in the morning she'd fling open a set of curtains that kind of said, "I'm up, it's all good." Well, when the curtains stayed closed 2 days running, the neighbour alerted the facility, and they came up and they found her still in bed, and she was taken to hospital, but she never regained consciousness. So then it was a matter of saying, what can we see from the data? There's no doubt in my mind that if we'd been monitoring that in real time, we would have picked up that stroke within half an hour. She's normally out of bed by 7, she's still in bed at 7:30, go and knock on the door. Quite simple. Whether or not she would have wanted that is another matter, because she was incredibly independent, was Mrs. L. I said to her one day, "Do your boys ring you every week?" And she said, "I raised my sons to be independent. If they're ringing me every week, I didn't do it right." She was gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So I don't know that she would have wanted to have been found after the stroke. I don't think she would have wanted to be cared for. But if we could have detected it earlier and prevented it, or at least let her sons know that it was imminent, maybe they could have come and visited her the week before she went. And we did actually find secrets in the sensors, so data there that from 10 days out, where we could have rung a specialist or got the boys up or something like that. So this is the power of AI and the sensor data in that sense, and she's special.
As I hear your talk, this feels like a very personal example to me. I mean, my mother had a mild stroke just about 6 weeks ago, actually. I'm from the UK, so my mother's in the UK. She lives all alone now. She doesn't have other siblings that are around, but they've got their own problems and lives to deal with. And so I do worry, she's living alone, and what if something happens? I'm obviously on the other side of the world. I can't get there immediately. So an AI system that could somehow give an early warning of that, I think would be amazing. But I guess my question is, these trying to kind of do this kind of smart home technology. They've been trying to do this for a while, actually. So, and yes, in the best case, you could instrument someone's home or monitor other things like social media and see if anything changes and see if that's a warning signal. Why do you think this technology isn't more widely applied now? What are the barriers to it actually being used in practice?
I think that partly it's because not everybody lives alone, and sensor firing is very difficult when you've got more than one person moving around, unless you have a wearable and it can pick up a signature, but other than that, it's really hard to tease out. People are concerned about cost, and even though it's not that expensive to set it up, but houses are all very different. So what sensor suite? Like, it's hard to sell a package of it. So I think that those are all barriers to it. There's an awful lot of stuff that we could be doing that we're so close to being able to do.
AI is poised to play a growing role in supporting us in our twilight years. And those same advances in AI are also transforming another crucial field. Next up is crime scene investigator Ben Lamont. Ben's the manager of technology strategy and data with the Australian Federal Police. His role covers strategy, data management, and specialised systems for the AFP. He's also led many forensic operations and played key roles in counter-terrorism and disaster victim identification missions, including the downing of Flight MH17. And despite what Ben says, he's a pretty cool guy.
So I was a CSI, crime scene investigator across the AFP for about 20 years. Not quite as cool as CSI. There is no sunglasses, a lot less Hummers. You wouldn't want to wear an expensive suit to a crime scene. It'd probably be ruined in the first week. But again, a really awesome career. And then about 3 years ago, I moved into the tech space. So I've kind of taken the skills that I had in forensics and applying them now to technology and especially around data analytics and AI.
Fantastic. And now one of the roles that you had, which I'm particularly fascinated by, is that you were Australia's lead forensics investigator on flight MH17. Is that right?
That's right.
So we're going to talk a little bit about MH17 and, what the role of AI could have been in piecing together what happened with MH17. But maybe just remind our audience, first of all, what was MH17? What happened with that flight?
Yeah, so MH17 was a flight, Malaysian Airlines flight that took off from Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands. It was going to Malaysia and then on to Australia. And unfortunately, that plane flew over the contested area within Ukraine at the time and was shot down by a Buk missile. Within that area, it was a contested area of Ukraine, so obviously access to crime scenes and things were seriously problematic for us and for the Dutch and the Belgians who were quite heavily involved, and the Ukrainian law enforcement as well, due to the fact that that area was a war front really at the time and has continued to be since. So
it was a massive forensics job. And maybe can you talk us through, what the teams did, both the broader team, but also the Australian team in terms of what did they have to do and to try and do the detective work to kind of piece together what actually happened?
Yeah, I think this is a great example of where AI would have made our jobs a lot easier. Like you're saying, it wasn't really mature to the level it is now, but we didn't have access to a crime scene because we had to be given access really by rebels who were held in that area. So we had to use images. So we, with all crime scenes now, we've got two components really, a digital and a real world component, and both AI will have an impact on. So in this case, digital evidence from journalists on the ground, from social media, from other areas, actually using that to start to piece together the crime scene itself.
And these were images of wreckage or?
Wreckage, human remains, property, pieces of what could be weaponry, and they were taken by journalists who were on the ground, who were given access, or by some of the Ukrainian local population as well. So that obviously went all up on the internet, and we had thousands and thousands of photos. So we had to manually go through each of those, assess what the item was, assess where that location was, if we can, using the background of those images. Huge amount of work. AI would have been really fantastic at this job with computer vision, being able to actually process those to rule out just those photos of, just someone on the side of a road versus a piece of wreckage, or really kind of let us hone in on what we really wanted to concentrate on, especially around the wreckage components. We had goals to end up at the crime scene and collect that material, understanding what material was there, how we were going to collect it, how we're going to package it, how we're going to move it out of that contested area. Photographs were obviously really important. So.
And I suppose one of the challenges, though, of using AI, because if you're using kind of standard AI, you often use, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of labeled images of that thing so that you can identify that thing in the future. Whereas you probably don't have a lot of images lying around of, bits of wreckage from a plane, because thankfully they don't crash very often. So do you still think it's something that the AI could help with, or do you see challenges in actually applying AI in that context?
I think both. I think it can help, but it is challenging. The kind of more generic models don't necessarily, they have planes as a whole, but not necessarily planes in parts, for example. So it's actually doing some training on components of planes. The good thing is that industry are doing a lot of this work anyway, because they want to know if the parts of a plane are to spec. So they are doing a lot of computer vision for within the factory. And, in this case and in other cases where we've investigated plane crashes, industry have been really forthcoming and help. So they would be able to provide models if they were using them today. So I think that component is just leveraging what other people are doing as well. Or if that doesn't exist, it's actually working out, is the juice worth a squeeze, that it's going to be quicker anyway to do some training of a model with those images and tag them, because that feed of images continued the entire investigation. And, we worked on MH17 for 8 years. So
I think the other area where I thought it maybe might be able to help, because I saw this nice video of what they had to do to understand what had happened, and they built this kind of cage that was full-size replica of the plane, and then as they found bits of wreckage, they tried to paste that wreckage to the appropriate place on the cage. So it was like this massive jigsaw puzzle. Once they'd done that, they could identify where there were fissures or where there was a bit of yellow paint that came from a missile and so forth. And that looked to me like a great application for an AI. If you had a digital version of that, it's basically an optimization problem, right? It's a massive jigsaw puzzle, something the AI should be able to do in its sleep.
Absolutely. And before we built that real model, we actually built a computer model, a digital twin of every part. So we used metallurgy, we used 3D scanning and laser scanning, and mapped every single piece of wreckage that we got. A lot of that wreckage was packaged up and shipped to the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands we actually scanned every single piece of material that we recovered. That created a digital twin, and then we used that to map. Now, at that time, it was a very manual process. It was trying to, like you say, a giant jigsaw puzzle with forensic investigators sitting there trying to go, where does this bit of wreckage sit on a plane? AI would have made that that job a large, like months and months of work, a lot more easy.
And another angle on that, which I know you've been doing some other work with Monash University, is that, you mentioned that these images, it was wreckage, but it might also be dead bodies, right? And if an investigator has to kind of go through all of that, that can be very, very traumatic. And if we can get AI to do that instead, then we could seriously reduce the amount of trauma that we as human beings have to go through. And I know you've been doing that in a slightly different context.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think continuous trauma, having to look at these images over and over again, is a massive issue for law enforcement, and PTSD within law enforcement and defence is a real issue. So we're doing work with Monash at the moment around child exploitation material, which we can apply that to death investigation if it works as well, and that is to have a warning put in front of our investigators or our forensic members that the photo that's coming next is most likely child exploitation material. And we have a campaign at the moment called My Pictures Matters, which is around getting adults to consent to providing children's images, because we didn't want to use children's images, obviously, that couldn't consent. So we're using adults if they could provide their photos, and that's to train the algorithms to recognise child exploitation material. So, and that's a live campaign at the moment.
Very interesting. Let's change tack slightly with you, though, because I know there's another area that you're working in, and in our kind of preamble before the show, you used a phrase which I confess I hadn't heard before, but I was very, very intrigued to hear more about, and that was the phrase body farms.
Yes.
So can you tell us what a body farm is, and what on earth has it got to do with AI?
Yeah, so a body farm is exactly that. It is a location here in New South Wales where people who donate their bodies to science and to the body farm itself, and there is a lot of people, and really does amazing community good by doing that. We put those bodies in different situations. So we bury them, we leave them in houses, we put them in areas where there's wind, there's no wind, and we're actually conducting forensic analysis to get a good corpus of knowledge about what happens after someone dies. And there's a thing called the post-mortem interval, really critical for forensic science, and that is to identify the time of death. So, we have a number of factors, and technology and other things do help, but a lot of the time it's the biological signs that are really key for us, especially when we've found human remains that we don't know when that person was killed or died. And we can use things like insects, lividity, which is the pooling of blood within the body, petechial hemorrhaging or hemorrhaging on the skin that happens when blood flow is restricted. These really complex factors that we can use to work out post-mortem interval. But there is a lot of complexity and a lot of issue around the environment having an impact on that. So wind flow, how quickly could insects access it? So we have this body farm, and we now have AI where we can start to combine these two data set that we're collecting through the body farm and then apply that to other cases. Because it's such a complex kind of algorithmic process, AI really does offer a massive opportunity for us in that
And under
space.
normal circumstances, I would have asked my normal question about AI is to say, well, you need a whole bunch of labeled data before you can apply it to AI, but you have the labeled data.
Yes.
You have your own body farm.
Using AI in forensics can bring a sense of closure, helping solve crimes or identifying victims of crime. But closure isn't just about solving mysteries. It's about finding a way to remember the loved ones we've lost and to celebrate their lives. June Kim is an associate lecturer in the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture at the University of New South Wales. Her research focuses on how death rituals are evolving due to technology and how AI is shaping the way we honour the dead.
Now, June, you're an artist, you're a technologist, you do a lot of very, very interesting work at the intersection of art and technology. And in particular, you've been doing some research recently looking at how death rituals are changing because of advances in new technologies. So can you maybe give us a broad overview, first of all, about what's going on in the whole world of death rituals and technology?
Well, I can't say that it's a kind of major move, but, anyway, we live, we are living, but, we are dying on the other side too. So, a death and death ritual, death is not just an incident, and death ritual is, cultural activities that we've been developing as human over the human history. So there is influenced by a long-term religions and cultures and regional-based kind of norms and customs and everything. So it's really hard to change or reform anything. But I kind of started thinking that when I die, it's kind of when I grow up, I want to be something. So I was thinking about when I die, how I want to be memorized, or how I want to be remembered. That kind of question I started with. Then I had I just realized that I have so many do and don't want. So first, I don't want to leave too much a carbon footprints. So that's what I don't want. And the second one is that, yes, AI, I actually want to contribute, continue my contribution to my small communities that I've been doing, and also societies. It would be great if I can leave some great research or anything, but not yet. But I want to be kind of remembered in that way, contribution. And AI came up, and now people, I know that people can actually have I can leave my facial and informations. It can be a 3D reconstructed, and my voice or maybe my a small portion of knowledge can be stored and redeveloped on the way. But do I really want? I don't know about that. Not yet. I haven't really decided that I would be happy to be having an immortal life as a 3D reconstructed June or digital version of June. So I'm not really sure about that. So anyway, I actually come up with so many things. And then, I started researching about there could be some, like-minded people. They don't have to be, focusing on technology like me, but, maybe people want to be remembered, or people want to be taking that ritual in a different way, a contemporary way, an alternative way. So we can see, if I cover all the non-technological sections, you can see rather than people buried in traditional way in the casket, people choose to be in tree barriers, woodland barriers, or remembered as a bench, a nice bench, and also some spontaneous activities and and so on. But as John introduced me, I love technology and I love art. So that's why I kind of wanted to create that, and also I love community. So that's why I kind of wanted to come up with something that I can implement technology and something that I could come up from a more creative side.
There are temples in Japan right now with Buddha statues with a USB port on them that people can plug in their memories of their loved ones. Is that right?
Yeah, the Ruridan one is they actually upload ashes. People's ashes. So people rather than having a big cemeteries or anything like that, and they have a very futuristic look of columbariums with back then over 2,000 Buddha statues already. So maybe now more. So the LED statues, and they uploaded some data, but not a full information that we expect now. So some informations. And ashes, but ashes not to the Buddha, and ashes somewhere. And then when people visit in the columbarium, and the actual Buddha will be lighting. So you actually do the sort of you meet and greet in that columbarium. So that's one of the examples.
And I know you're also working on this yourself. So you're developing some kind of sculpture that is kind of redefining the way that we look at death.
Yes, so it's kind of at at the boundary of a HCI, a more HCI side and the creative art, and I see the users. I see a disease as a user too. So when we talk about HCI, human-computer interactions, we just focus on the human alive people interacting with, but for my sculpture, that sculpture is actually the replacement of a place that we can visit. Because I've just introduced you just very briefly that what I read from the Remember Me project that done by University of Hull, and they actually mentioned about that people really regret when many people actually regret when they scattered their beloved ashes somewhere rather than store, because they sometimes they really want to go and somehow meet in a way. So then they lost. So that's why I just come up with this kind of sculpture idea, a public sculpture idea. So it's not for one person, it's probably a whole community. So people can visit sometimes when they want to come and touch. We want to rub the tombstones and kind of, it's a physical way to interact. So they can do. But the major part of that sculpture is, the people, the people can actually, the left family can access and control the sculpture to make it some lights floating, but the lights can be, their beloved family or the followers of beloved family. Because I don't have kids, so I always thought, maybe when I die, nobody will visit me, kind of like that. So that's why when somebody, let's say that John, you visit me.
I will definitely visit you, June.
Let's say that you
especially
visit me.
if you've got this lit up sculpture.
Oh, okay. So let's say that you visit me, and then and then there could be some other people that people are there, and then all those people are also visited.
So it's almost like a social network between dead people.
Yes. So that people won't be lonely, kind of that. It's kind of my imagination, but that's why I said that it's kind of in between my creative ideas and HCI. So they will be visited. But at the same time, I think that the important part of that ritual is sharing, grieving, bereavement. And then now we are so individualized, but I really like the community led death rituals long time ago, like we used to do before industrialized time. So I kind of like borrow that term. But at the same time, like we don't, like when we have something really nice, like this kind of like event, I will definitely share on my Instagram or LinkedIn. But when I feel sad, I don't want to share it. I really want to be left anonymously, right? So I kind of wanted to make a try now, like a little, like a rock shape, but it's like a robot, and kind of you can feel the temperature. So you just like hold, and when you hold, and somebody else's rock will be lightning. So it's sharing feeling, but anonymously. Without language.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that's kind of things that I am preparing.
Thank you so much, June.
Have you ever wondered whether you could live forever? The idea of immortality has captivated humanity for centuries. So what if technology holds the key? Even if we could cheat death, should we? And what about the ethical and legal implications? What rights would our deceased selves have in this new form of digital existence? Helping us explore these questions is our final guest, Patrick Stokes. Patrick is an associate professor of philosophy at Deakin University in Melbourne. He's also a writer and media commentator, and in his recent book, Digital Souls, A Philosophy of Online Death, he says we've got a moral duty to the digital dead. My first question to Patrick was, what do we even mean by death?
Until recently, I thought that must be a pretty easy question to answer. But then I was listening actually to a podcast that you'd done and discovered that there are at least 3 definitions of death.
Well, there's no definition so easy that a philosopher can't make it monstrously complicated and unworkably so. But this is actually an area where, interestingly, a lot of the philosophical questions have actually been driven by technology. Because, I mean, if you think about most of human history, pretty straightforward to work out when that had happened, because all the things that we take to be criterial of death, so loss of breathing, loss of heart function, loss of consciousness, permanent loss of consciousness, all that stuff all happened at once, the beginning of decomposition. Occasionally you hear about people waking up in coffins and things, but in general it was pretty straightforward. But then you get changes occurring from the 1960s onwards where some of those things can start to come apart. So you can have people whose heart and lung function can be continued through artificial means, even though there's no higher brain activity going on anymore. Dana was talking earlier about the cortex and all of the bit of the brain where all the thinking happens, where all the stuff happens that makes us us, or most of the stuff. And, so those things could come apart. There were also, patients could live on, for instance, in states where they were able to breathe on their own, they were able to digest food on their own, but there, again, was no kind of higher brain function going on. And so it suddenly became an interesting question as to when we take death to have occurred, given that death is a binary concept. You're either alive or dead, but we're trying to map it onto a much messier underlying biological reality. And that gets even more important when you factor in things like organ donation and when we can be said to be taking organs from a person who has died versus actually ending a person's life. So all of those things become kind of important in a clinical context and in a practical context. And so there are definitions that have been developed for those contexts, which are reasonably conservative. They tend to say that death has occurred when there's a complete loss of cardiopulmonary function and all complete loss of brain function, and irreversible in both cases. There are others who favour what's sometimes called a higher brain definition of death, which is basically saying that when the cortex has died, when there's no possibility of consciousness anymore, then we can regard that person's body as dead, even if it's still breathing on its own, it's still doing other things on its own. And then there are other definitions as well. Some philosophers are now talking about a moral definition of death and saying, well, fundamentally what we care about is whether this person is still alive in the sense of being one of us, being a person, being a part of the moral community for whom we have a certain kind of regard. And so there are moral definitions of death that are starting to appear in the literature too. None of this stuff is being operationalised in a clinical context, I want to say. That's a long way off.
So we got at least 4 then there.
Yeah, well, and then there's questions around
we've got, bodily functions have ceased. We've got what we would normally call brain dead, so that's number 2. Then these 2 new ones, at least to me, which is, is your consciousness dead, and then 4th is your morality dead. Is there a 5th one with technology? We've got digital legacies now, right? We all create digital artifacts that out-survive us. Does that actually blur the boundaries even more? And can we start to talk about the fact that, we might be dead on those first 4 definitions, but that in some way we actually continue to live on because of these digital artifacts that we created and continue to have an existence?
I think it's really important to differentiate, this is something I've argued for in my work, between living on for ourselves and living on for other people. And you can say that even with all the digital legacies, which I'll talk about in a moment, but even in that context, you can say there's no real way of living on for ourselves in that context. A lot of transhumanists try and come up with ways in which they think we could upload a consciousness, but there's all sorts of philosophical problems about that. That won't stop them trying, but as a philosopher, I'm going to wade in and say, well, that's all fine in practice, but will it work in theory? But even with that, there's still a sense in which we can survive for other people. And we always kind of had, right? The dead live on in the life world of the living, right? The dead still play a role in our lives. They still make us do things. They still make us behave and interact in certain ways. And we still care about the dead in certain kinds of ways. And that's, I think, actually being made clearer with the way in which we do survive in certain kinds of ways for other people online. So you use the term digital legacies. And that's a term that a lot of corporations and governments and families and individuals are all kind of wrestling with, which is that just as when you die, you leave behind a whole range of material artifacts, a sort of material estate, your house and your books and your dog and your, whatever else. In the same sort of way, we all leave behind these digital legacies now too. We leave behind things like Facebook profiles and social media profiles in general, emails, just a huge amount of data that we're all producing every day, which continues to exist after we die. And there's been a lot of talk of this in terms of digital legacies, as if it's just another kind of estate that we leave behind. There's a concern, though, that that's actually not adequate for what the things that we leave behind. Because when you think about it, this is our digital face. And I think you actually used that term earlier, June, that we have a kind of a face that we put forward digitally, which is made up of data, and which is how we are present in the lives of so many people. We're actually increasingly more present in many people's lives through online mediated ways than we are face-to-face in physical flesh. And so a lot of researchers in this space have started talking about digital flesh and also saying instead of digital legacies, we need to be thinking about digital remains, the remains that we leave behind, which are, and when you think about remains like corpses, you don't inherit corpses. You don't have them, you don't have copyright in corpses. What you have are obligations of stewardship and certain kind of rights to determine how that corpse will be disposed of or preserved or how it's going to be treated. And those are where I think we're needing to develop new norms and new approaches to try and work out how we deal with these digital remains.
Yeah. And then we come to AI, of course, which, I was struck by what you said earlier, which is that, there's no sense in which we can survive death for ourselves, but we can for others. And now we're seeing a trend where people are actually encoding chatbots with the personality of an individual who has passed away as a way to continue a conversation with them and memorialize them in some way. And there's a very famous example of this, Roman Mazurenko. Tell us about Roman.
Yeah, so Roman Mazurenko was a Russian tech entrepreneur, and he very sadly was killed in a car accident in Moscow in 2015 in his early 30s, I think. And as his friends all came together after he died and they were trying to sort of, work out how to best to memorialize him, one of these friends, a woman called Eugenia Koida, who's also a tech entrepreneur, she has a company that produces AI chatbots. And so one of the things she did by way of memorializing him was to take all of the text messages he'd sent her Interestingly, he actually didn't leave behind a very big social media profile, but he did leave behind a huge number of text messages. She fed them into an AI chatbot, made that available as an app, and anyone can download Roman Mazurenko for free on their phones and chat to a dead man. Now, I've done so. I didn't find it a really good simulacrum of talking to an actual person, but I didn't know him, and also I don't speak Russian, so I was getting a translated version, right? So apparently, though, his friends who were looking at the stuff in Russian and also who knew him, do report that it sounds like him, and it sort of reproduces to some extent at least the experience of talking to their friend. So this is the thing with digital remains, is not only can they be preserved, and that's become a really important part of many people's contemporary mourning practices, visiting somebody's social media profile and writing messages to them, they can also be reanimated. And that opens up a really intriguing range of ethical questions about who has the right to reanimate somebody's digital remains in that way, who has the right to set up such a chatbot, under what conditions, what can they be made to do, which is part of a larger question we're having about AI-driven reuses of people's images and so on after they die. And also interesting questions about what sort of agency we can have before we die to say, yes, I'm happy for this to happen. No, I don't want this to happen. And even if we say yes, how long do we take that to hold for, given that we're talking about things that could potentially go indefinitely?
Yeah, it certainly does raise a lot of ethical questions and indeed philosophical questions. It's lucky that I happen to have a philosopher here to answer some of those philosophical questions. Because the immediate thing that strikes me, I mean, the Mazurenko case, his friend who created that chatbot went on to produce this company which allows any of us actually to upload our data and to essentially train an AI companion to respond to us in a way that we want a companion to respond. That company has now got 2 million subscribers worldwide. So this is not an isolated case, actually. But the main question that sticks in my mind is this a good thing for grief? Is it better to just accept the fact that the person has moved on, draw a clean slate? You don't want to completely forget them, of course, but to be, I've read about how his friend even today is still communicating with the dead Roman once a week, and she certainly says she gets a lot out of that, because the main thing she gets out is that there are times in all of our lives where we just want to download, right? We have a stressful day and we just want to download on someone who will listen to us. And you can do that with your friends and your partners and stuff, but probably there's a limit, right? Whereas if you've got an AI that understands you and can be that listening ear and will always say the right thing, that could potentially be a good thing. So is it a good or a bad thing for grief that we're recreating the dead in this way?
Yeah, this is actually a really live debate in the philosophical literature on this at the moment, and in the wider literature on death technology. And partly it comes down to cultural factors, of course, because different cultures grieve differently. Some cultures have a kind of a transition model of death where somebody dies and they go from being part of your life to somehow no longer being part of your life because they've gone off to the afterlife or become an ancestor, or just in some way they're removed. And then you have other cultures which have what's sometimes called a continuing bonds model of grief. And there's been a fair bit of pushback actually recently against the idea that it's about moving on, right? That somebody dies and you go through your work of mourning and then you move on with your life. There's some talk that's not really true to our phenomenology of grief. Grief doesn't really work like that. The dead do remain part of our world, a less salient part and a less kind of demanding part in some respects, but they're still there. But yeah, there are these really interesting questions about whether these chatbots, whether they can disrupt grief, whether they can make us forget, if you like, that the person has died, and whether that's going to have deleterious effects. But there's also a really interesting question about whether there's something degrading to the dead if we can simply replace them. So if these chatbots become simply tools of memorialization, a way of remembering somebody who's died, that could, I think, be very powerful and very healthy. The worry is that we can then easily slip into a kind of replacement mode where we say, oh, it's so bad that, my friend has died, but doesn't really make a difference because I can still chat to him online, so it's like he's never left, right? That's where I think we run into a problem, because what you're then saying, in effect, is that the people you love can be replaced by chatbots, which is...
Not a good thing to say.
Not a good thing to say now, but it may be that in 100 years that sounds perfectly natural to us, and that's the thing that worries me, is that we might just get so used to this stuff that we just completely gloss over those issues.
And with that, we've reached the end of this second season of Everyday AI. In this series, we've heard how AI is rapidly advancing and shaping our world, from the cradle to the grave. AI is revolutionizing every aspect of our lives, helping us learn, communicate, and work, and even giving us new ways to connect with loved ones who have passed. But as with most technologies, AI carries risk. AI is developing at an ever-increasing pace, and it will be up to us, as humans, to steer and shape what it does for us in the future. I remain optimistic when it comes to AI and its place in our world, but that's because I'm optimistic about human intelligence. The best and most useful applications of AI come from combining artificial intelligence with what's in our own brains. But to realize this, we as humans will need to steer and direct AI. And yes, sometimes tell it not to do things. AI isn't always good, but when applied responsibly, it will be a positive force in the world. I'm John Whittle. Thanks for joining me. Thanks to our guests Dana Bradford, Ben Lamont, Patrick Stokes, and June Kim. Everyday AI is a CSIRO series created by me and Nikki Galovich. Alexandra Pursley is our supervising producer, and Laura Riley-Newton is our producer and sound engineer from Audiocraft. Script and production support by Jess Hamilton. We'd love to know what you think, so please subscribe to Everyday AI and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.